What do you think of when you think of the 4th of July? One of the things that I like to do is reflect on what others have thought about with respect to the Declaration of Independence on the 4th of July. And John Quincy Adams has given at least 2 speeches that I think are extremely important for any American to consider and to reflect upon. What Adams wants every American to recognize and celebrate is there's a providential role that America plays in its founding. And one of the things that is incumbent of it to do is to educate people about its enlightened principles. It's not just merely a parade and a cookout, and although all those things are important, they don't really get to the enduring principles that are behind that great annual holiday. So in a speech on Independence Day, he really clarifies, I think, what the founders meant by independence. It's easy to think and just reduce it to just declaring a breakup with Great Britain or England. But he says the object of the Declaration was twofold. First, to proclaim the people of the 13 united colonies, one people, and in their name and by their authority to dissolve the political bands which had connected them with another people, that is, the people of Great Britain. Now, he's paraphrasing the Declaration of Independence, and he does that in at least one other speech. And the reason why he does this is he thinks that the annual celebration of 4th of July should remind the Americans of the principles, the enduring principles of the American founding. In fact, when the speech goes on, he talks about how important the grievances are against King George III. But he says those pale in significance compared to the enduring principles that the Declaration is really articulating. And so he calls us back repeatedly to go back to understanding the Declaration of Independence. What were those enduring principles that Adams wants us to be reminded of? So I have, of course, always at my disposal our U.S. Constitution reader that Hillsdale publishes, and I'm perfectly happy to teach it every semester. But so when you go back to the Declaration of Independence, everybody knows that it's divided into 5 unequal parts. There's the introduction that introduces the political context in which it takes place. Then there's what's called the preamble, and that's where you get that very famous line, "We hold these truths to be self-evident." It's followed then by a list of grievances and then a conclusion. But throughout Adams's speeches, he spotlights something that's really crucial, and I think it's easy to overlook, and I overlooked it for many years, and I want to draw it to your attention. This is how it begins. When in the course of human events it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with one another, and to assume among the powers of the earth the separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and nature's God entitle them, a decent respect to the opinions of mankind requires that they should declare the causes which impel them to the separation. So there's at least 3 important points that we want to keep in mind when we look at this. First, the Declaration is not simply about the doctrine of individual rights. It is that. But in the first sentence, Jefferson notes the importance of the sovereignty of a nation. Let's hear that again. When in the course of human events it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with another people, and so forth. What Adams does repeatedly in a number of speeches is to draw our attention to the fact that just as individuals have natural rights, so too do nations. So the first thing to note at the beginning of the Declaration of Independence is the importance of national sovereignty. And you could say, in a way, that the Declaration, in a way, is America's first piece of foreign policy. It indicates that nations are sovereign and people have a right to their self-determination. The other thing that's crucial to note is the role of God. And he's invoked several times in the Declaration. It's important to pay attention when and how he's being invoked. In that same passage, Jefferson says the following, "And then to assume among the powers of the earth the separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and nature's God entitle them." What that essentially means is that national sovereignty is something that is God-given, just as individual natural rights are. And what that shows you is that their conception of God is one of a lawgiver. It is God's great wisdom that he adjudicates to the people of the earth a equal and separate station with others. And there's no reason for anyone to live or put up with tyranny. And so that's the first beginning, the first paragraph of the Declaration. It's pretty remarkable. Now, the second part of the Declaration, which is really crucial, is what I would refer to and many refer to as the preamble. And here you get something that's really so familiar that I fear we might just simply take it for granted. It's that famous phrase, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal and that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. That's the second reference to God. And God there, again, is playing the role of a lawgiver. And he has given the law that all human beings have unalienable rights. Those rights don't come from government. They don't come from kings. They come from God. But I want to draw your attention to the first line of that paragraph. Now, Jefferson could have written, these truths are self-evident, but he doesn't say that. He says, we hold these truths to be self-evident. And I think he does that for two reasons. The difference between just simply stating truths are self-evident as opposed to saying that we hold these truths as self-evident is the emphasis is on hold shows that there was a general consensus among the American founders that natural rights was the fundamental principle upon which the country was founded. And to say that we hold these truths implies not just simply a consensus, but it reminds us that that kind of consensus can only be born out of some kind of civic education. So in a way, the Declaration is not only a piece of, say, American foreign policy, it's perhaps America's first great piece of civic education. You need an education to help support these principles. It's clear that you need a theological education. You need an education in John Locke and Aristotle and Montesquieu, among others. So this, we hold these truths, this consensus wasn't just merely taking people's opinions and then just simply agreeing on them. It's clearly the product of a civic education, an education steeped in Western civilization and its greatest texts. The second thing I want to talk about in that particular opening is that among the inalienable rights that we have the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Now, I want to pause here for a moment because we're so familiar with that phrase that I think it's easy, again, to take it for granted and also, I think, misunderstand it. There are those, and this is likely to offend some people, who are critics of the American founding, who believe that many of our problems that we have today are a product of principles baked into the American founding. And many of them will point out this phrase, the pursuit of happiness, as being one of the major culprits. Because in their mind, the pursuit of happiness gives this impression that pursuit of happiness is just subjective, that it actually is a quest without any real end. And it's not clear what they mean by happiness. Now, I would push back against that. And I think that when you look at Thomas Jefferson's letter to Henry Lee, and when he invokes Aristotle, whose great work, the Nicomachean Ethics, stresses that happiness essentially consists in the exercise of moral virtue, we can start to see that the founders had something far more political in mind and would hardly ground the country in something subjective. Here's what John Quincy Adams says in Thoughts on Government, which he published in 1776. We ought to consider what is the end of government before we determine which is the best form of government. Very Aristotelian. You can't think of what is the best form of government for human beings to flourish if you don't know what the end or the purpose of government ought to be. And so he continues, upon this point, all speculative politicians will agree that the happiness of society is the end of government. As all divines and moral philosophers will agree, meaning all theologians, whether you consult theology or whether you consult philosophy, all will agree that the happiness of the individual is the end of man. From this principle, it will follow that the form of government which communicates ease, comfort, security, or in one word, happiness to the greatest number of persons, and in the greatest degree is the best. But what does happiness mean? That still begs the question. Adams answers it in the following. All sober inquiries after truth, ancient and modern, pagan and Christian, have declared that the happiness of man, as well as his dignity, consists in virtue. So the right to pursue happiness is the right to pursue moral and religious virtue. And the purpose of government is to secure our means to doing so. And so when I think of the 4th of July, of course, I think of it as an annual celebration of America's independence. But when I look to greater thinkers than myself, like John Adams and others, it's really an invitation to go back to what that Declaration of Independence essentially was establishing. It is establishing principles of moral virtue. It's establishing principles of natural right. It's showing us distinctions between civilization and barbarism. And all of this is something that I think we should all, on an annual basis, if not on a regular basis, reflect on deeply.